Nobody move. Nobody touches that dog. Iron Jack's voice cracked through the clubhouse like a gunshot, stopping 30 armed men cold. Blood pooled beneath the animal's broken body. Grizzly Henderson, the most feared enforcer in Oakland, dropped his weapon and fell to his knees beside it, hands shaking. Something about this dog broke him. Before we go further, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The rain hadn't stopped in 6 hours, and it wasn't going to stop tonight. Inside the clubhouse, the air smelled like gun oil, cigarette smoke, and old leather. The kind of smell that settled into a building over 30 years and never left. Iron Jack Callahan sat at the head of the long steel table, his forearms resting flat against the surface, his eyes moving from man to man like he was counting something only he could see. "We do this clean," he said. "No mistakes, no loose ends. Everybody in this room walks away from this deal, or nobody does." Around the table, 11 men nodded. Some of them had been riding with Jack for 20 years. Some had been patched in 6 months ago. All of them understood the weight sitting on that table wasn't just about money. It was about survival. Grizzly Henderson stood near the back wall, arms crossed, watching the door the way he always did. He was the kind of man who made rooms go quiet just by walking into them, 6'4", 260 pounds of scar tissue, and silence. Men who didn't know him assumed he was slow. Men who knew him understood he simply didn't waste words. "You hear something," Grizzly said suddenly. Jack looked up. "What?" "Outside, rear dock." The room went still. Danny Cochran, the newest prospect, shifted in his chair, his knee bouncing under the table. Nobody paid him any attention. Not yet. "Probably a raccoon," said Marcus, one of the older members, waving a hand. Grizzly didn't move. He was already walking toward the back hallway, one hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Jack watched him go, then looked back at the table. "Finish the numbers," Jack said. "I want this wrapped before sunrise." But the meeting didn't finish, because 30 seconds later, a sound tore through the building that stopped every man's heart at once, a violent, desperate scratching against steel, followed by a low, broken whimper that sounded almost human in its suffering. "What the hell is that?" someone said. Grizzly was already at the rear door, a gun drawn, when it happened. The old steel security door bolted and reinforced the same door that had kept out rival clubs, federal agents, and armed intruders for over a decade. Buckled outward for just a moment, then a shape hurled itself through the gap at the hinge, collapsing onto the concrete floor in a heap of blood and matted fur. For 3 full seconds, nobody in that room breathed. "It's a dog," Marcus said, disbelief flooding his voice. "It's just a dog." But it wasn't just a dog. Not the way it looked. Its ribs showed through torn, bloodied fur. One back leg dragged uselessly behind it, the bone visibly wrong beneath the skin. Its muzzle was gray with age, encrusted with dried blood, and its eyes, when it lifted its head one final time, locked directly onto Grizzly Henderson's face. "Kill it," Danny said quickly, too quickly. Could be diseased, could be a setup, a distraction. Somebody could be using it to breach the perimeter. "Shut your mouth," Grizzly said, his voice low and dangerous. He was already crouching down. The room watched in stunned silence as the most feared man in the club, a man who had once broken another human being's arm for spilling a drink on his jacket, lowered himself onto the cold concrete floor beside a dying animal and reached out one massive, tattooed hand. "Grizzly," Jack said carefully, stepping closer. "What are you doing?" "I don't know," Grizzly admitted, and that admission alone was strange because Grizzly Henderson always knew exactly what he was doing. Something about it. Something's wrong here. Not wrong like a threat, wrong like... He stopped himself, shook his head. "I don't know how to say it." The dog's chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. Its eyes never left Grizzly's face. "Somebody get water," Jack said finally, "and get Doc Riley on the phone, now." Danny stood frozen by the table. "Jack, with respect, we don't know where this thing came from. It broke through a reinforced door. That's not normal. Dogs don't do that." "No," Jack said slowly, looking down at the animal, "they don't." Marcus crouched beside Grizzly, examining the dog's injuries with the practiced eye of a man who'd patched up more gunshot wounds than most emergency room doctors. "This isn't an accident," he said. "Look at this leg. That's not a car hit. That's a gunshot wound, healed wrong, then reopened. And these cuts along its side, those are from running through wire fencing. Barbed wire chain link, something like that." "Repeatedly." "How far you figure it ran?" Jack asked. Marcus shook his head slowly. Paws are worn down to nothing. Pads split open. I've seen this before on working dogs that cover serious distance. My gut says this animal ran further than any dog should be able to run. 50 miles, 100, maybe more. The room fell into a heavy, uneasy silence. That's not possible, Danny said, his voice climbing half an octave. No dog runs 100 miles. And no dog breaks through a steel security door, Grizzly said, not looking at him. And yet, the dog whimpered again, softer this time, and its head sank back down against the concrete. Grizzly's jaw tightened. Slowly, carefully, like he was defusing a bomb, he slid his hand beneath the animal's neck and felt around the matted, blood-soaked fur. There's something here, he said, a collar. Jack knelt down on the other side. Get it off, careful. It took almost a full minute. The leather had been buried so deep in the fur, so worn and cracked with age, that at first Grizzly thought it was simply part of the animal's scarred hide. But as he worked it free, the shape became unmistakable, old hand-tooled leather, the stitching done by someone who clearly took pride in the work. That's club craftsmanship, Marcus said quietly. I'd know that stitch pattern anywhere. Old Pete used to make collars like that for the guard dogs back before he stopped talking. Back before what? Jack said. Marcus didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on something stamped into the underside of the leather, half obscured by dried blood and years of wear. Grizzly turned it toward the light, and the room seemed to tilt sideways. Burned into the leather in letters that had clearly once been sharp and clean was a name, A. Davis. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound in the room was the dog's ragged breathing and the rain hammering against the metal roof. That's not possible, Marcus finally whispered. Say it, Jack said, his voice flat and dangerous. Say the name out loud. Marcus swallowed hard. Arthur Davis. Knuckles. This is Knuckles' collar. The name hit the room like a physical blow. Danny's face went pale. Two older members near the back exchanged a look that Grizzly caught immediately, a look loaded with history, with something unspoken and heavy. Knuckles has been gone for 3 years, one of them said. Vanished. Everybody figured wrong, apparently, Jack said, cutting him off. He was staring at the dog now with an intensity that made even Grizzly uneasy. This is his dog. Scrap. I remember Scrap. Knuckles never went anywhere without that animal, not even to church meetings with the other clubs. So where's Knuckles? Danny asked. And why is his dog showing up here half dead 3 years later, breaking through a steel door in the middle of the night? Nobody answered him, because nobody had an answer. Grizzly ran his thumb gently along the dog's matted ear. Scrap's eyes fluttered, struggling to stay open, fighting against exhaustion that looked less like sleep and more like the body finally shutting down after being pushed far, far past its limits. He didn't come here to die, Grizzly said quietly. Jack looked at him. What? He came here for a reason. Look at him. Look at what he's fighting through just to keep his eyes open. This isn't an animal that wandered in lost and confused. This is an animal that had somewhere specific to be, and he's not letting go until he gets there. As if in answer, Scrap's paw twitched weakly, scraping against the concrete, dragging his body forward another inch toward Grizzly's leg. Doc's on his way, someone called from across the room. 15 minutes out. He might not have 15 minutes, Marcus said grimly, pressing a torn shirt against the worst of the wounds. Grizzly's face hardened into something none of them had seen before. Not the cold fury he showed in a fight, not the flat brutality he was known for on the street. Something closer to grief. Then we buy him 15 minutes, Grizzly said. Get the medical kit, the real one, not the roadside junk, and somebody boil water. Jack watched his enforcer take command of the room with an urgency usually reserved for a brother going down in a firefight, and something shifted in his chest. He'd known Grizzly for 18 years. He'd seen him shot, stabbed, beaten half to death in a parking lot outside Sacramento, and never once had he seen the man's hands shake the way they were shaking now. Talk to me, Jack said, quietly crouching beside him. What aren't you saying? Grizzly didn't look up from the dog. Knuckles pulled me out of a burning car in 2009. You remember that everybody remembers the crash, but nobody remembers that Scrap was there too. Little 4-month-old puppy barking his head off, running back and forth between me and Knuckles, like he was trying to drag us both out himself. I owe that dog my life just as much as I owe Knuckles. The room went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, heavier, more respectful. Then we save him, Jack said. Whatever it takes. Danny shifted uncomfortably near the table, his eyes darting toward the exit, then back to the dog, then to Jack. And if he doesn't make it, if this is some kind of setup, some kind of trap disguised as a sob story. Danny, Jack said, without even turning his head, if you say one more word right now, I'm going to forget you're wearing our patch. Danny's mouth snapped shut. Marcus worked quickly, cleaning the deepest wound along Scrap's side with practiced, careful hands. Whoever did this to him wasn't trying to just hurt him, he said. Look at the pattern of these cuts. This is torture, not an accident. Somebody wanted this dog to suffer. Or somebody wanted to stop him, Grizzly said quietly. Jack's eyes narrowed. Stop him from what? From getting here. The words hung in the air like smoke. 20 minutes later, Doc Riley arrived, soaked through from the rain, his medical bag already open before he'd even fully stepped through the door. He took one look at the animal and his face went grim. This dog shouldn't be alive, he said, kneeling down beside Marcus. Not with injuries like this. Not after whatever he's been through. Can you save him? Grizzly asked, and there was something in his voice that made Doc Riley look up sharply. Something almost like pleading, coming from a man who never pleaded for anything. I'll do what I can, Doc said, but I need this room cleared. I need space, and I need it quiet. Jack stood and raised his hand, and without a word, the room began to empty. Men filing out into the hallway, leaving Doc Riley, Marcus, and Grizzly alone with the dying dog. Jack lingered by the door, watching the leather collar still clutched tightly in his hand. He turned it over slowly, studying the stamped name, the worn stitching, the small brass buckle that had somehow survived whatever hell this animal had crawled through to get here. Then he noticed something else. A slight bulge along the inner lining of the collar where the leather had been doubled over and stitched shut in a way that didn't quite match the rest of the craftsmanship. Marcus, Jack said quietly, get over here for a second. Marcus glanced up from where he was helping Doc Riley, then walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. Jack held out the collar. Feel that. Marcus ran his fingers along the seam, frowning. That's not original stitching. That's been redone. Somebody opened this up and sewed it back shut. Recently, Marcus examined the thread more closely. The leather around it is worn to hell, but this stitching itself looks newer. Maybe weeks old, maybe less. Jack's pulse quickened. Get me a knife. Marcus produced a small folding blade from his pocket, and Jack carefully worked the tip along the reinforced seam, cutting through the newer thread with steady, deliberate motions. The leather peeled apart, revealing a small, hidden pocket sewn into the lining of the collar. Inside was a micro SD card wrapped in a thin strip of plastic to protect it from moisture, and folded tightly beside it a small scrap of paper stained dark brown with something that was unmistakably old dried blood. Jack's hands went still. Marcus, he said, his voice suddenly hoarse, get me a laptop, now. Behind them, Scrap's breathing hitched, then steadied, then hitched again. Doc Riley worked with quiet urgency, his hands moving fast, his expression unreadable. Grizzly stayed crouched beside the animal's head, whispering something too low for anyone else to hear, his massive hand resting protectively against the dog's matted fur. He's stabilizing, Doc said, finally exhaling. Barely, but he's stabilizing. Grizzly closed his eyes for one brief moment, and if anyone had been watching closely, they might have seen the tension leave his shoulders for the first time in 20 minutes. Across the room, Jack unfolded the blood-stained paper with trembling fingers. The handwriting was rough, hurried, clearly written under duress, some words barely legible where the blood had smeared across the ink. He read the first line and his face went white. Marcus, he said, get everybody back in here, right now. Jack, what does it say? Jack looked up, and in his eyes was something none of the men in that clubhouse had seen from him in years. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Something that looked like a man staring directly at a truth he'd spent 3 years refusing to accept. Knuckles is dead, Jack said. He's been dead for months. And whoever killed him, he stopped, swallowed hard, looked back down at the note. Whoever killed him had help. Somebody inside this club sold him out. The door to the hallway swung open and the men who had been waiting outside flooded back in, drawn by the tension in Jack's voice. Danny pushed his way toward the front of the group, his face carefully arranged into an expression of concern. What's going on? He asked. What did you find? Jack looked up slowly, his eyes moving across every face in the room, lingering just a fraction of a second longer on some than others. Somebody in this room, he said quietly, helped murder Arthur Davis. And that same somebody has been sitting at our table, eating our food, wearing our patch for 3 years, pretending they didn't know a damn thing about it. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain seemed to pause. Grizzly stood up slowly from beside the dog, his massive frame unfolding to its full height, and for the first time that night he turned to face the room, his eyes cold and sharp and utterly without mercy. "Somebody better start talking," he said, "because I promise you, whoever did this scrap already knows who you are. He ran 100 miles to tell us, and dogs like that, they don't forget a face." Behind him on the concrete floor, wrapped in blankets and hooked to an IV line, Doc Riley had managed to secure. Scrap's eyes opened one more time. They moved slowly across the room, past Marcus, past Jack, past the older members standing near the back wall, and stopped, locked unwavering on Danny Cochran's face. A low, guttural growl rose from deep in the dog's throat, weak but unmistakable, a sound that carried more accusation in it than any human voice could have managed. Danny took an involuntary step backward. "Why is it looking at me like that?" Nobody answered him, but every man in that room was suddenly looking at Danny Cochran with an expression that hadn't existed 30 seconds earlier. Jack folded the blood-stained note carefully and slid it into his jacket pocket, his eyes never leaving Danny's face. "We're going to find out exactly what happened to Arthur Davis," he said, his voice low and steady and terrifying in its calm. "Every detail, every name, every dollar that changed hands. And when we do—" He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting every man in the room feel the full weight of what was coming. There is nowhere on this earth the traitor is going to be able to hide. Outside, the rain kept falling, hammering against the steel roof of the clubhouse like 1,000 small warnings. And on the concrete floor, wrapped in blankets, fighting for every breath, Scrap the dog closed his eyes again, not in surrender, but in something closer to relief. He had made it. He had crossed 100 miles of blood and wire and gunfire to deliver a message from a dead man to the only family that could still avenge him. Now it was up to them to finish what he started. The laptop screen flickered to life on the table, and every man in the room pressed closer shoulders, touching, breath held. Marcus plugged in the micro SD card with hands that weren't quite steady, and Jack stood directly behind him, arms crossed, jaw set like stone. "There's a video file," Marcus said, dated, time-stamped. "Play it," Jack said. The video opened on darkness, then resolved into grainy desert terrain, shot from what looked like a phone held at chest height, hidden moving. A man's labored breathing filled the audio. Then a voice, rough, exhausted, unmistakably a voice several of the older members recognized instantly. "That's him," one of them whispered. "That's Knuckles." On screen, Arthur Knuckles Davis stumbled through scrub brush blood, soaking through his shirt, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. His voice, when he spoke directly into the camera, was ragged with pain and fear. "If anybody finds this," Knuckles said, "if Scrap makes it back," he coughed, doubled over, kept walking. "They sold me out. The cartel knew exactly where I'd be, exactly when. Nobody knew that route except Club." Somebody talked. The video shook violently. Gunfire cracked in the distance, closer with each burst. "I don't have much time," Knuckles said, his voice breaking. "Scrap, listen to me. Go home, boy. Go home." The video cut to black. Nobody in the clubhouse spoke. Danny stood near the back, his face bloodless, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "There's more," Marcus said quietly. "Audio file. No video, just sound." He clicked it open. Two voices emerged from the laptop, speakers muffled, distant, clearly recorded through fabric, maybe a shirt pocket. "You told them where he'd be," a voice said, unfamiliar, accented cold. "You told them the route." "I told you I needed the money," a second voice answered, and this one made the blood drain from every face in the room because it was younger, thinner, unmistakably local. "I never said kill him. You said scare him. You said—" "Shut up!" the first voice snapped. "It's done. You get paid. You keep your mouth shut. You understand me." The recording cut off. Jack's hands were shaking now, and not from fear. Grizzly stood so still he might have been carved from granite, His eyes locked on the laptop screen like he could reach through it and strangle the voice himself. "That's not Knuckles' voice," Marcus said slowly. "That second voice. That's somebody else. Somebody who was there." "Play it again," Grizzly said. Marcus replayed the audio. Around the room, men exchanged glances, straining to place the voice running through 3 years of faces and names and nights spent riding together. "I know that voice," an older member named Frank said suddenly, his brow furrowed. I know that voice." "From where?" Jack demanded. Frank shook his head, frustrated. "I can't place it. It's younger, He stopped. His eyes drifted almost involuntarily toward the back of the room. Toward Danny. Danny felt the shift in attention like a physical blow. "Don't," he said quickly. "Don't you dare look at me like that. You think I sold out? Knuckles, I've been patched in 3 years. 3 years, and you're gonna—" "Nobody said your name," Jack said quietly, cutting him off. "Why are you so quick to defend yourself?" The room went silent. Danny's mouth opened, then closed. "Because," he said, finally forcing his voice to steady, "you're all looking at me like I've got a target on my back and I'd have to be an idiot not to notice." Grizzly crossed the room slowly, each footstep deliberate, until he was standing directly in front of Danny, towering over him. "Where were you 3 years ago, the week Knuckles disappeared?" "I wasn't even patched in yet," Danny said. "I was still a hangaround. I barely knew the man." "That's exactly right," Marcus said, suddenly his eyes widening. "You weren't patched in yet. So how would the cartel even know to contact you? How would they know you were somebody worth recruiting?" Danny's jaw tightened. "I don't know, maybe they didn't. Maybe you're all building a case against me because a dog looked at me funny." "He didn't look at you funny," Grizzly said, his voice dropping low and dangerous. He growled. "That dog has been through hell and back, and the first thing he did when he opened his eyes in this room was warn us about you." "Dogs bark at things," Danny snapped. "It doesn't mean anything." "Doesn't it?" Jack said quietly. The tension in the room stretched tighter, and for a moment it seemed like it might break into violence right there until Doc Riley's voice cut through the standoff from across the room. "He's crashing," Doc said sharply. "I need help now." Every head turned. Scrap's body had gone rigid on the blankets, his breathing suddenly shallow and rapid, his legs twitching in involuntary spasms. "Grizzly?" Doc called. Grizzly was there in 2 strides, kneeling beside the dog, his big hands hovering helplessly over the animal's trembling body. "What's happening? What's wrong with him?" "Shocked, Owen," Doc said, working fast, pressing a stethoscope against Scrap's ribs. "His body's been running on adrenaline and nothing else for God knows how many hours. Now that he's safe, now that he's stopped, it's catching up to him all at once." "Do something," Grizzly said, and his voice cracked on the words, cracked in a way that stunned everyone in the room who thought they knew exactly what kind of man Tom Henderson was. Doc administered something from a vial, his hands quick and practiced, despite the tension radiating off every man crowded around him. "Come on," he muttered almost to himself. "Come on, you made it this far. Don't quit on me now." 30 seconds passed, then a minute. Scrap's breathing remained shallow, erratic, terrifying in its unpredictability. "Doc," Jack said quietly, "I'm working on it." Doc snapped, not looking up. Grizzly leaned close to the dog's ear, his voice dropping to a whisper that barely carried past the animal's matted fur. "You didn't run 100 miles to die on my floor. You hear me? You've got more fight left in you than that." "I know you do." Scrap's chest rose, fell, rose again, and slowly, painfully began to steady. "There," Doc said, exhaling hard. "There it is. He's stabilizing. Barely, but he's stabilizing." The tension broke across the room like a held breath finally released. Grizzly's shoulders sagged, and for one unguarded moment, the most feared man in the club looked simply exhausted, simply human. "We almost lost him," he said quietly. "We didn't," Jack said, resting a hand briefly on his shoulder. "He's still here, and he's still got answers we need." Danny, still standing near the back wall, seemed to realize the room's attention had shifted away from him, and something in his posture relaxed slightly, a small involuntary loosening of the shoulders that Marcus caught out of the corner of his eye. Marcus said nothing, but he filed it away. An hour passed in tense, watchful silence. Doc worked steadily, cleaning wounds, setting the broken leg with a temporary splint, monitoring vitals with the grim focus of a man who understood exactly how close they'd come to losing something none of them could fully explain the importance of. Jack pulled Marcus and Grizzly aside near the front of the clubhouse out of earshot from the rest of the room. We need to move carefully, Jack said. Whoever betrayed Knuckles is still walking around free, still trusted, still wearing our patch. If we accuse the wrong man, we tear this club apart from the inside. If we let the right man walk, we're no better than the people who killed Arthur. So what's the play? Grizzly asked. We watch, Jack said. We watch everybody. We don't tip our hand, and we let Scrap tell us what he knows because that animal has been more reliable in the last 2 hours than any lie detector I've ever seen. Marcus nodded slowly. There's something else. That second voice on the recording, the one that sold Knuckles out. I want to run it through an audio analysis. I know a guy used to do forensic work for the department before he got tired of the politics. He can isolate voice patterns, maybe even get us something concrete. Do it, Jack said, quietly. There's a problem, Marcus added, lowering his voice further. If Danny is who we think he is and he finds out we're running audio analysis, he's not going to sit around waiting to get caught. Men like that run, or worse. Jack's eyes hardened. Then we make sure he doesn't find out. But across the room, Danny Cochran was already watching them, already noting the way they huddled together, the way their voices dropped low enough that he couldn't catch the words, and something cold and calculating moved behind his eyes. He pulled out his phone, angled his body toward the wall, and typed a short message with quick, nervous thumbs. They know something, might need to move up the timeline. He hit send, then slid the phone back into his pocket just as Frank walked past, glancing at him with an expression Danny couldn't quite read. Everything all right, Spitfire? Frank asked, using the nickname the prospects had given him months earlier, back when things were simpler, back when nobody in this room looked at him like he might be a snake wearing their colors. Fine, Danny said, forcing a smile. Just tired, long night. Longer than you know, Frank said. And there was something pointed in the way he said it, something that made Danny's stomach twist. The night stretched into early morning. Scrap remained unconscious but stable, his breathing steady, his body finally beginning the slow work of healing. Doc Riley refused to leave his side, catching sleep in short bursts in a folding chair he'd dragged over from the corner. Jack sat alone at the head of the table, the blood-stained note spread out before him, reading it again and again, searching for details he might have missed the first time. The trader's been paid before the note read in Knuckles' shaky, blood-smeared handwriting. Not just this once. Ask about the warehouse shipment last spring. Ask who knew the route. Jack frowned, pulling out his phone, scrolling back through old club records until he found what he was looking for. A shipment 18 months back ambushed en route to a buyer in Sacramento. 2 men injured. Product lost. At the time, they chalked it up to bad luck, a chance encounter with rival interests. Now it looked like something else entirely. Marcus, Jack called softly. Marcus appeared beside him, rubbing sleep from his eyes. What is it? The Sacramento shipment. 18 months ago. Who set the route? Marcus's face went pale as the memory surfaced. Danny helped plan the logistics. It was one of his first real assignments after getting patched in. He said he wanted to prove himself. Jack's jaw tightened, and the ambush happened exactly where the road diverted from the main highway. Jack, Marcus said slowly, that's not proof. Lots of people knew that route. But how many people knew it who also happened to be conveniently absent when it went wrong? Jack asked. Danny called in sick that day. You remember said he had food poisoning. Marcus's expression darkened as the pieces began aligning in his mind, each one clicking into place with sickening clarity. I need to make some calls, he said. I need to check something. He disappeared into the back office, and Jack sat alone once more with the note, with Scrap's shallow breathing, filling the silence with a growing cold certainty, settling into his chest like a stone. By mid-morning, Marcus returned, his face grim, a manila folder clutched in his hand. I pulled old financial records, he said, sliding into the seat across from Jack. Danny's been making deposits, small ones cashed, nothing that would draw attention on its own. But over the last 3 years, it adds up to almost $80,000. Jack stared at the folder without opening it. $80,000. His salary from the garage doesn't come close to explaining it, Marcus continued. And here's the thing that really bothers me. The deposits started 6 weeks before Knuckles disappeared. Jack closed his eyes briefly. Get Grizzly. Grizzly arrived within minutes, his expression unreadable, as Marcus laid out the financial records, the timeline, the connection to the Sacramento shipment piece by piece. building a case that grew heavier and more damning with every new detail. It's not enough, Grizzly said finally, though his voice carried no real conviction. Circumstantial. A good lawyer tears this apart in 5 minutes. We're not going to court, Jack said quietly. We're going to get a confession. How? Grizzly asked. Jack looked toward the corner of the room where Scrap lay wrapped in blankets, chest rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm, still unconscious but undeniably improving. We wait for him to wake up, Jack said. And we let Danny watch us wait. Let him sweat. Guilty men don't handle waiting well. That afternoon, as if summoned by the conversation itself, Scrap's eyes fluttered open. The reaction in the room was immediate and electric. Grizzly was at his side in seconds, Doc Riley close behind, checking vitals with careful, urgent hands. Easy, Doc murmured. Easy, boy, you're safe. Scrap's eyes moved slowly, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings, the faces hovering above him, until they settled on Grizzly's face and something in the animal's posture relaxed just slightly, a recognition that hadn't been there when he first collapsed through the door. He knows you, Doc said, surprised. He recognizes you. Knuckles must have talked about the crash, Grizzly said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he was clearly struggling to control. About the fire, about Scrap being there. Jack approached slowly, careful not to spook the animal. Can he stand? Not yet, Doc said. Give him time, his body's been through hell. But Scrap wasn't finished. His head turned slow and deliberate, scanning the room with an intensity that seemed far too sharp for an animal that had nearly died hours earlier. His gaze passed over Jack, over Marcus, over Frank, standing near the wall, and stopped on Danny. The growl that rose from his throat this time was stronger than before, deeper, unmistakable in its hostility. Scrap's front paws scrabbled weakly against the blanket, trying to push himself upright, despite his injuries. Despite Doc's hands trying to hold him still. Easy, easy, Doc said urgently. You're going to tear your stitches. But the dog's focus never wavered from Danny, and the sound coming from him now was almost a snarl, a raw, primal warning that carried across the silent room like a verdict already rendered. Every man present turned to look at Danny. This is insane, Danny said, his voice climbing panic, bleeding through the forced calm. You're going to take a dog's word over mine? Over 3 years of loyalty, over everything I've done for this club. Nobody said anything about the dog's word being final, Jack said carefully, watching Danny's face with sharp clinical attention. But it is interesting, wouldn't you say, that out of every man in this room, he's chosen you specifically to react to? Dogs are unpredictable, Danny said. Maybe I remind him of somebody. Maybe he's scared and confused and lashing out at the nearest person standing. You're not the nearest person standing, Marcus pointed out quietly. You're all the way at the back of the room. Danny's mouth opened then closed. Sweat had broken out along his hairline, despite the cool temperature of the clubhouse. I think, Jack said slowly, standing up, we need to have a longer conversation, Danny. Just the two of us. Maybe with Grizzly and Marcus present for the sake of thoroughness. You can't be serious, Danny said, and his eyes darted toward the exit, a small involuntary movement that everyone in the room noticed. Going somewhere, Grizzly said, his voice deceptively soft. No, Danny said quickly. No, I need some air. This is a lot. Accusations, a half-dead dog growling at me, financial records you clearly pulled together specifically to build a case against me. Nobody said anything about financial records, Marcus said quietly. The room went dead silent. Danny's face drained of all remaining color. He'd made a mistake, and every man present had caught it, the words hanging in the air, like a confession all on their own. Danny started, then stopped. How did you know about the financial records, Danny? Jack asked, his voice dropping into something cold and final. Danny's eyes darted from face to face, searching for an exit that didn't exist, searching for words that might undo what he'd just revealed. I want a lawyer, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. This isn't a courtroom, Grizzly said, stepping closer, his massive frame blocking any hope of escape. This is family, and you sold family out for $80,000. You don't understand, Danny said, panic finally breaking through completely, his composure shattering into something desperate and raw. You don't know what they threatened me with. You don't know what would have happened if I said no. Then explain it, Jack said, right now, every detail, because in about 30 seconds my patience runs out, and I promise you, Danny, you do not want to see what happens after that. Danny's legs seemed to give out slightly, and he sank into the nearest chair, his hands trembling, his eyes fixed on the floor. They came to me 18 months ago, he said, his voice cracking, before I was even patched in. They knew things about my family, about my sister's debts, about problems I thought nobody outside my own head even knew existed. They said they just wanted information. Nothing serious, just routes, schedules, nothing that would hurt anybody. The Sacramento shipment, Marcus said flatly. Danny nodded, not looking up. That was supposed to be it. One time. Get the debt paid off, walk away clean. But once you're in, you're in. They kept coming back. More money, more information, and every time I tried to say no, they'd remind me exactly how easy it would be to make my sister disappear. And Knuckles, Grizzly said, his voice dangerously quiet. Danny's whole body flinched at the name. I didn't know, he said, his voice breaking completely, now tears finally spilling over. I swear to God, I didn't know they were going to kill him. They said they just wanted to talk to him, scare him off some territory dispute. I gave them the route because I thought it would just be a warning, a message, nothing more than that. But it wasn't, Jack said. No, Danny whispered. It wasn't. The room sat in stunned, heavy silence, the weight of the confession settling over every man present like a physical burden. Even Scrap, still weak and trembling on his blankets, seemed to sense the shift, his growl finally quieting into something more like exhausted grief. You're going to tell us everything, Jack said, finally, his voice carrying an authority that left no room for argument. Every name, every contact, every dollar, and then we're going to figure out exactly what we do with you. Danny nodded miserably, tears streaming down his face. There's something else, he said. Something you need to know, and I don't think you're going to like it. Say it, Grizzly said. Danny looked up, his eyes wide with a fear that went beyond his own predicament, a fear that suggested whatever was coming next was far worse than anything they had already uncovered. They're not done, he said. The cartel. They know Scrap made it here. I told them before I understood what it meant, before I realized what he was carrying. They know he's alive, and they know he could expose everything. And if they know that, he stopped, swallowing hard. They're coming here, he finished. Tonight. The room erupted into motion chairs, scraping back voices, rising men reaching instinctively for weapons stashed within arm's reach. Jack's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Everybody quiet. The room fell silent, 30 pairs of eyes fixed on him, waiting. How many? Jack asked, turning back to Danny. I don't know exactly, Danny said, but it's not a small operation. They don't do things small. 15, maybe 20 men heavily armed. They've done this before. Warehouse raids rival territory disputes. They don't send warnings. They send annihilation. Grizzly's hands had curled into fists at his sides, his eyes burning with a fury that hadn't fully surfaced until this exact moment. They're coming here to finish what they started with Knuckles, and to make sure the dog never talks again, Jack said grimly, glancing towards Scrap, still weak, still healing, still utterly incapable of defending himself if violence arrived at their doorstep tonight. We need to move him. Uhima, Doc Riley said urgently. Somewhere safe, somewhere they won't think to look. No, Jack said. His voice suddenly surprisingly calm, a stillness settling over him that every man in the room recognized from years of following him into dangerous, uncertain situations. We're not running, not this time. Jack, Marcus said carefully, if what Danny's saying is true, we're talking about a small army showing up at our door. We need time to prepare, time to call in reinforcements, time to think this through properly. We don't have time, Danny said quietly. That's what I've been trying to tell you. They move fast. If they know I've already talked, if they think I've flipped. He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Jack turned toward Danny, his expression unreadable. Do they know you've talked? Danny hesitated, then shook his head slowly. Not yet. I haven't sent anything since the message I sent earlier tonight before all of this. But if I go dark for too long, they'll get suspicious. Then you're going to keep them thinking everything's normal, Jack said. For now. Danny's eyes widened. You want me to keep working for them after everything I just told you? I want you to buy us time, Jack said. And you're going to do it because it's the only thing standing between you and a very different conversation about your future in this club. Danny nodded quickly, understanding the threat beneath the words with perfect clarity. Jack turned to face the room, his voice rising with an authority that seemed to fill every corner of the clubhouse. Listen to me, every man in this room. Tonight we are not victims. We are not going to run, and we are not going to wait for them to come and finish what they started with Arthur Davis. We are going to be ready. We are going to control exactly how this plays out. What's the plan? Frank asked, his voice steady despite the tension radiating through the room. Jack's eyes swept across every face present, and for a moment the exhausted, grief-stricken man, who had spent the last several hours reading a dead friend's final message, seemed to disappear, entirely replaced by something harder, colder, more calculating. We let them come, Jack said. We let them think they're walking into an easy kill, and then we make sure not one of them walks back out. Grizzly's expression shifted, something dark and satisfied settling into his features. You want to trap them. I want to end this, Jack said, tonight, once and for all, for Arthur, for every man he ever rode with, and for that dog lying right there who crossed 100 miles of hell just to make sure the truth didn't die with him. Across the room, Scrap's ears twitched at the sound of Jack's voice, and though he remained too weak to lift his head, his tail moved once against the blanket, a small, exhausted acknowledgement that seemed to understand on some instinctual level exactly what was being promised. Marcus began pulling up blueprints of the clubhouse on the laptop, tracing possible entry points, calculating sightlines, murmuring calculations under his breath. Grizzly moved toward the weapons locker, already organizing gear, with the brisk efficiency of a man who had done this before and understood exactly what tonight was going to require. Danny sat alone, forgotten for the moment, amid the sudden flurry of preparation, his face pale, his hands still trembling, caught somewhere between terror of the men he'd betrayed and terror of the men he'd been forced to betray them for. Jack knelt down beside Scrap one final time before the preparations consumed the room entirely, resting a gentle hand against the dog's head. You did your part, he said quietly. You brought us the truth. Now it's our turn to finish it. Scrap's eyes met his, steady and clear, despite the exhaustion and pain still radiating through his broken body, and in that look, Jack found something he hadn't expected. Not just gratitude, not just recognition, but something closer to trust, absolute and unwavering, the same trust Arthur Davis must have placed in this animal every single day of his life. Outside, the sun was beginning to set behind heavy gray clouds, and somewhere out there in the growing darkness, an army was already moving toward them, unaware that the men inside the fortress they were about to attack had just been given every advantage they would ever need. The clubhouse, once a place of business and brotherhood, was about to become something else entirely. A trap. And at its center, wrapped in blankets guarded by the very men his loyalty had saved Scrap, the dog closed his eyes once more, finally allowing himself to rest his mission, not yet complete, but no longer his to carry alone. Marcus's fingers moved fast across the laptop keyboard, pulling up floor plans, sightlines, every camera angle the clubhouse security system could offer. Grizzly stood over his shoulder, arms crossed, studying the layout with the focused intensity of a man calculating exactly how many ways tonight could go wrong. Rear dock's already compromised, Marcus said. That door held for 10 years and a half, a dead dog still broke through it. If 20 armed men hit that same point with intention, it's not going to slow them down for more than a few seconds. Then we don't try to stop them there, Jack said. We let them think it's still weak. We let them come through exactly where we want them. Frank leaned over this table, tracing a finger along the blueprint. Funnel them into the main floor. Kill the lights. We know this building blind. They don't. That's the whole plan, Jack said. Home field advantage. They're expecting to walk into a slaughter. We're going to give them one, just not the one they're expecting. Danny sat off to the side, hunched forward in his chair, hands clasped so tightly together his knuckles had gone white. Nobody was looking at him anymore, and somehow that felt worse than the accusations, worse than the growling, worse than watching every man in the room silently recalculate 3 years of shared history in the space of an afternoon. What about me? He asked quietly. Jack didn't even turn around. You're going to sit exactly where I can see you, and you're going to keep your phone exactly where Marcus can monitor it. If they text you, you respond exactly the way I tell you to respond. Nothing more. And after tonight, Danny asked, if we survive this, what happens to me? Now Jack turned, and the look on his face made Danny wish he hadn't asked. We'll discuss your future once there is one to discuss. Grizzly moved past them both toward the back of the room where Scrap lay wrapped in fresh blankets. His breathing steadier, his eyes tracking Grizzly's approach with something that had shifted in the last several hours from pure exhaustion into cautious alertness. Hey, buddy, Grizzly said softly, crouching down. Big night ahead. You just rest. Let us handle the rest of it. Scrap's tail thumped once weakly against the blanket. Doc Riley, who hadn't left the dog's side in over 12 hours, looked up with dark circles under his eyes. His fever's down. Vitals are stronger than I expected, honestly. This animal's got more will to live than half the men I've treated in an ER. He's Knuckles' dog, Grizzly said simply, as if that explained everything. And in a way it did. The clubhouse transformed over the next several hours. Weapons were checked, rechecked, distributed. Lights were mapped and tested, switches identified for a system Marcus had rigged years earlier for exactly this kind of contingency, though nobody had ever imagined they'd actually need it. Men who had spent the morning in stunned grief now moved with cold, purposeful efficiency, grief converting itself into something harder and more useful. Motion sensors on the perimeter fence. Marcus reported, checking a tablet. If they come the way I think they'll come, we'll have 8, maybe 10 minutes warning before they breach the outer gate. That's enough time, Jack said. It's enough time if everybody's exactly where they need to be. Also, Grizzly said, and not a second before. Danny's phone buzzed in his pocket. Every head in the room turned toward him instantly, the sudden tension so sharp it felt like the temperature had dropped. Read it, Jack said. Danny pulled out the phone with shaking hands. His face went pale as he read the screen. It's them. They want confirmation. They're asking if the dog is dead. Tell them yes, Jack said immediately. Tell them it's handled. Danny's thumbs hovered over the screen. If I lie and they find out, they're not going to find out, Grizzly said, because by the time they realize the truth, it's going to be far too late for it to matter. Danny typed the message, his hand trembling so badly he had to retype it twice. He hit send and set the phone down like it had burned him. They responded, he said after a moment staring at the screen. They said good. They said the operation moves ahead as planned. 2 a.m. The room went utterly silent. 2 a.m., Jack repeated. That gives us roughly 9 hours. 9 hours to turn a clubhouse into a kill box, Frank said grimly. 9 hours to make sure every man who murdered Arthur Davis never sees sunrise again, Grizzly corrected. The preparations accelerated. Marcus disabled the exterior lighting on a timed delay, ensuring the compound would appear dark and unguarded from a distance while remaining fully operational from the inside. Frank and 2 other longtime members reinforced the interior barricade points, moving heavy steel furniture into positions that would look natural to an untrained eye, but would actually create narrow, controlled corridors of movement, corridors that led directly into open sight lines for armed men waiting in the shadows. Jack pulled Grizzly aside near the ammunition locker, his voice dropping low. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Always, Grizzly said. If it comes down to it tonight, if Danny tries to run, tries to warn them, tries anything, can you handle it? Because I know what he means to you right now isn't the same as what he meant yesterday. Grizzly's jaw tightened. He helped kill Arthur. Whatever loyalty I might have felt toward him as a prospect died the second I heard that confession. That's not what I asked. Grizzly held Jack's gaze for a long moment. I can handle it, he said finally, but I want him to face what he did, in the open, not in the dark, not quietly disappeared. He answers for this in front of everybody, the same way Arthur deserved, better than dying alone in a desert because of a debt Danny couldn't pay. Jack nodded slowly. Agreed. Across the room, Doc Riley called out suddenly. He's trying to stand. Every head turned. Scrap had pushed himself up onto his front paws, his back legs still splinted and useless, but his eyes were sharp now, focused, scanning the room with an alertness that hadn't been there even an hour earlier. Easy, Doc said, moving to steady him. You're not ready for that yet. But Scrap pushed forward anyway, dragging himself a few inches across the blanket, his gaze fixed on the door on the growing darkness outside, as if some instinct buried deep in his exhausted body understood exactly what was coming and refused to be left out of it. He knows, Grizzly said quietly, crossing the room to kneel beside him. He knows they're coming. He's not fighting tonight, Doc said firmly. Not in his condition. One wrong move and he tears everything I just spent 12 hours stitching back together. I know, Grizzly said, resting a gentle hand on the dog's head, pressing him gently but firmly back down onto the blanket. You've done enough, buddy. You brought us the truth. Let us handle the rest. Scrap resisted for a moment longer, then finally settled, though his eyes remained open alert. watching the door with a vigilance that mirrored every armed man now taking up position throughout the darkened clubhouse. As evening deepened into full night, Jack gathered every man for one final briefing. 31 members stood in a loose circle around the main floor, faces grim, weapons checked and ready, the weight of what was coming settling over the room like a physical presence. Tonight, Jack said, his voice carrying easily across the silent room, we're not just defending this clubhouse. We're finishing what Arthur Davis started when he sent his dog running 100 miles through hell to bring us the truth. Every man walking through that door tonight had a hand in his death, directly or indirectly, and every one of them is going to answer for it. What about survivors? Frank asked. If any of them surrender. We're not murderers, Jack said. We take what we need, confessions, evidence, names that go up the chain, and then we hand every bit of it to the authorities. This isn't about revenge alone. It's about making sure this never happens to another man in this club, another family, another loyal animal that has to watch its owner die in the dirt. Grizzly stepped forward. But make no mistake, if they come in here shooting, we shoot back and we don't stop until the threat is over. Arthur deserves that much. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, grim and resolute. Positions, Jack said, now. The clubhouse fell into a strange, tense stillness as 31 men melted into the shadows, taking up positions behind barricades and elevated sightlines along corridors specifically engineered to funnel intruders into carefully controlled kill zones. The exterior lights dimmed to nothing, leaving the compound looking dark, abandoned, exactly as vulnerable as the cartel would expect after receiving Danny's message, confirming the dog's death. Danny sat in the center of the main floor, exactly where Jack had positioned him, his phone resting on the table in front of him. Marcus stationed close enough to monitor every message that came through. You feeling okay? Marcus asked quietly, and there was something almost sympathetic in his voice despite everything. No, Danny admitted. I feel like I'm going to throw up. Good, Marcus said. You should. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. 9 o'clock became 10. 10 became 11. The tension in the room stretched tighter with every passing minute, men shifting silently in their positions, adjusting grips on weapons, checking watches, waiting. At 11:30, Danny's phone buzzed again. The sound cut through the silence like a gunshot. Read it. Jack's voice came quietly over the small radio earpiece Marcus had fitted into Danny's ear earlier. Danny picked up the phone, hands trembling. They're asking about club security. How many men are typically on site overnight? Tell them skeleton crew, Jack said. 4, maybe 5. Tell them everyone else went home after the dog situation, that the club's rattled, disorganized. Danny typed the response, his fingers clumsy with nerves. He hit send and waited, the silence in the room, somehow louder than any noise could have been. They responded, he said after a moment. They said perfect. They said this confirms everything. They're moving up the timeline. 1:30, not 2. 1:30, Jack repeated over the radio, and though his voice remained steady, Marcus could hear the shift in urgency beneath it. Everybody tighten up. We just lost 30 minutes of prep time. Throughout the darkened clubhouse, men adjusted their positions, checked their weapons, one final time, settled into the stillness required for what was coming. Grizzly remained near Scrap, crouched low in the shadows beside the dog's blanket, one hand resting protectively on the animal's back, the other holding a shotgun, steady across his knees. Almost time, he murmured, more to himself than to the dog. Almost time to finish this. Outside in the darkness beyond the compound's perimeter fence, headlights appeared in the distance, faint at first, then growing steadily brighter as multiple vehicles approached along the access road, engines deliberately quiet, running dark, exactly the way a professional strike team would approach a target they believed to be unprepared. Marcus's tablet buzzed with a silent alert. Motion sensors triggered, he whispered into the radio. Outer perimeter, multiple heat signatures. I'm counting, He paused, scanning the readout. 18, confirmed 18 armed individuals approaching from the east access road. 18, Jack repeated quietly. Danny said 15 to 20. He was right. Small comfort, Grizzly muttered. The vehicle stopped roughly 200 yards from the outer fence, and even without visual confirmation, every man in the clubhouse understood exactly what was happening. Armed men disembarking silently, forming up, beginning their approach on foot under cover of darkness, moving with the practiced discipline of men who had done this many times before. 10 minutes, Marcus whispered. Maybe less. Jack's voice came through the radio steady and calm, despite the storm gathering outside. Everybody hold your positions. Nobody moves until my signal. We let them come all the way in. We let them think they've already won. The minutes crawl by with unbearable tension. Through the compound's exterior, cameras feeding silently into Marcus's tablet. The shapes of armed men became visible, moving in practice formation across the open ground toward the rear dock. The same door Scrap had broken through less than 24 hours earlier. The door they clearly believed remained the compound's weakest point. They're heading straight for the rear entrance, Marcus whispered. Just like we figured. Perfect, Jack murmured. Let them. The first man reached the damaged security door and paused, examining the buckled frame with what even the camera feed could identify as satisfaction confirmation. In his mind that the intelligence they'd received was accurate, that the club truly was as vulnerable as Danny's messages had promised. He signaled to the others. One by one, shapes filed through the broken door into the darkened interior of the clubhouse, weapons raised, moving with silent, deadly precision through a building they believed was nearly empty. They had no idea they were being watched. They had no idea every step they took was carrying them deeper into a trap built specifically around their own confidence. Jack watched the count climb on Marcus's tablet as more and more shapes entered the building. 12, 15, 17. Where's the 18th? Grizzly whispered. Marcus scanned the exterior feed. Rear vehicle. Looks like he's staying with the cars. Lookout, probably. We'll deal with him after, Jack said quietly. Right now, focus on what's inside. The armed men moved deeper into the main floor of the clubhouse, weapons sweeping the darkness, clearly searching for the skeleton crew Danny had promised them, 4 or 5 exhausted, disorganized bikers. Easy targets in a building they believed to be nearly abandoned. Instead, they found nothing. Empty space. Silence. Shadows that gave away no secrets. A voice, low and accented, cut through the darkness. The same voice from the audio recording, unmistakable, even in a whisper. Spread out. Something's wrong. It was the moment Jack had been waiting for. Now, he said quietly into the radio. The clubhouse erupted into chaos. Every light in the building blazed on simultaneously, blinding after the extended darkness, and in the same instant, flashbangs detonated at 3 separate points across the main floor, the concussive blast disorienting the intruders completely, dropping several of them instantly to their knees, hands clutching at ringing ears and blinded eyes. Now, Jack's voice roared no longer through the radio, but shouted directly across the chaos, and 31 armed men emerged from carefully concealed positions. Weapons raised, the trap finally violently springing shut. Gunfire erupted immediately, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, muzzle flashes strobing through the smoke and confusion. The intruders, still reeling from the flashbangs, barely had time to orient themselves before the club's men were firing from elevated, protected positions, cutting down the confused invaders in a hail of controlled, devastating fire. Left flank, Grizzly bellowed, his shotgun booming twice in rapid succession, dropping 2 men who tried to scramble for cover behind an overturned table that offered no real protection at all. Frank fired from a barricaded position near the north wall, his shots methodical and precise, each one finding its mark with the kind of accuracy that came from decades of practice. Danny, still seated at the center table where Jack had positioned him, threw himself to the floor as bullets began ricocheting off the steel walls around him, screaming something incoherent that was lost entirely in the chaos. Amid the gunfire and smoke and chaos, one of the intruders broke free from the main engagement, sprinting toward the back corner of the room where Scrap lay wrapped in blankets, weak and unable to defend himself. He's going for the dock. Doc Riley shouted, diving for cover as bullets tore through the space where he'd been standing moments earlier. Grizzly turned, saw the threat, and felt something inside him snap loose entirely. Not fear, but a rage so complete and total it eclipsed everything else happening in the room. He fired, missed as the man ducked behind cover and began moving across the floor with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size. The intruder reached Scrap's blanket weapon, raised, aiming down at the helpless, injured animal, and Scrap moved. Despite the splinted leg, despite 12 hours of surgery and stitches and barely stable vitals, the dog lunged upward with everything he had left, jaws clamping down hard on the man's forearm, throwing off his aim just as the weapon discharged the bullet, bearing itself harmlessly into the concrete floor, instead of into the animal it had been meant to kill. The man screamed, staggering backward, trying to shake the dog loose, and in that single crucial second of distraction, Grizzly arrived, driving his shoulder into the intruder with the full force of his massive frame, slamming him into the wall hard enough to crack the drywall, following with a single brutal strike that ended the confrontation instantly. "Scrap!" Grizzly shouted, dropping to his knees beside the dog, who had released the man's arm and collapsed back onto the blanket chest, heaving blood seeping through fresh reopened wounds along his side. "He's hurt again!" Doc Riley yelled, scrambling across the chaotic floor toward them, ducking beneath the continuing gunfire. "Get him covered," Grizzly roared, positioning his own body between the dog and the ongoing firefight, absorbing the risk himself rather than allow another bullet anywhere near the animal who had just impossibly saved his own life a second time. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity, but had in reality lasted less than 4 minutes. The intruders, disoriented from the initial ambush and cut down systematically by men who had spent hours preparing exactly for this moment, began to break some, attempting to flee back through the rear entrance, only to find it blocked others, throwing down weapons and raising trembling hands in desperate surrender. "Hold your fire on anyone who surrenders." Jack's voice cut through the chaos, and gradually the gunfire subsided, leaving behind a smoke-filled room littered with fallen bodies, the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging thick in the air. The silence that followed felt almost more deafening than the gunfire itself. Jack moved slowly across the floor, surveying the aftermath, counting the fallen, identifying the handful who remained alive, wounded, disarmed, kneeling with hands raised in the wreckage of what had until minutes earlier been their carefully planned massacre. "Secure the survivors," he ordered. "Zip ties watch their hands. We need them alive for questioning." Frank and 2 other members moved quickly among the wounded intruders, restraining them, checking for concealed weapons, working with the grim efficiency of men who had trained for exactly this scenario without ever truly believing they'd need to execute it. Grizzly remained beside Scrap Doc Riley, working frantically to address the reopened wounds, his hands moving fast, his expression tight with concentrated focus. "Is he going to be okay?" Grizzly asked, his voice raw with an emotion he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. "I don't know yet," Doc said honestly. "He tore 2 of the stitches, and he's lost more blood than his body can really afford right now. But he's still breathing. He's still fighting." "He saved my life," Grizzly said quietly. Again. Across the room, Jack knelt beside one of the surviving intruders, a man in his 30s with a wounded shoulder, his face pale with pain and fear. "You're going to tell me everything," Jack said, his voice deceptively calm, despite the violence that had just consumed the room around them. "Every name in your organization, every connection, every dollar that ever changed hands to have Arthur Davis killed. And you're going to do it now because the alternative is significantly less pleasant than a conversation." The man's eyes darted around the room, taking in the bodies of his fallen comrades, the armed men surrounding him, the utter completeness of the trap he'd walked into. "I'll talk," he said quickly, desperately. "I'll talk, just don't kill me." "Nobody's killing you," Jack said. "Not tonight. Tonight you're going to help us finish what your organization started 3 years ago in that desert. And then the authorities are going to make sure you spend the rest of your life regretting every choice that led you here." As Jack began the interrogation, extracting names, dates, financial trails that would eventually connect not just to Arthur Davis's murder, but to a web of corruption stretching far beyond anything the club had initially imagined, Marcus approached quietly, his tablet in hand. "Jack," he said, "you need to see this." Jack stood following Marcus toward the exterior camera feed, still active on the tablet screen. Marcus pulled up footage from the parking area outside the compound where the 18th man, the lookout who'd remained with the vehicles, was clearly visible. He wasn't standing guard anymore. He was on his phone, speaking rapidly, gesturing with obvious panic as he clearly relayed news of the disaster unfolding inside back to someone on the other end of the call. "He's reporting in," Marcus said. "Whoever's above him in this operation, they're about to know exactly how badly tonight went." "Can we get audio?" Jack asked. Marcus shook his head. "Too far from any of our exterior mics. But whatever he's saying, it's not good news for whoever he's talking to." Jack watched the grainy footage for a long moment, his expression hardening. "Then we need to move fast. If word gets back to whoever's running this operation, they're going to start covering tracks, destroying evidence, disappearing people who might talk." "What do you want to do?" Marcus asked. Jack turned back toward the room, toward the bound and bloodied survivors of the failed assault toward Grizzly, still kneeling protectively beside Scrap's trembling form toward Danny, curled on the floor near the overturned table alive, but utterly shattered by everything he'd witnessed and everything he'd caused. "We call the police," Jack said. "Now, before this goes any further, before anyone else disappears into that desert the way Arthur did." "Jack," Frank said, approaching from across the room, his voice carrying a note of surprise. "You sure about that? We've got bodies on the floor, evidence of an armed confrontation. That's a lot of exposure for the club." "I'm sure," Jack said, and for the first time since the note had been discovered inside Scrap's collar, something like peace settled into his expression. "Arthur didn't send that dog running 100 miles just so we could handle this quietly and let it disappear. He sent it so the truth would come out. All of it. And that's exactly what's going to happen." He pulled out his phone, dialing slowly, deliberately, while behind him the wounded survivors of the cartel's failed massacre knelt in silence. And in the corner of the room, wrapped in blood-stained blankets, Scrap's eyes remained fixed on Grizzly's face, steady, despite the pain, as if some part of the exhausted animal understood that the fight, Arthur's fight, the fight he had crossed 100 miles to bring home, was finally truly coming to an end. The phone rang twice before connecting. "This is Iron Jack Callahan," Jack said, his voice steady and clear, despite the chaos of the room around him. "I need to report an armed assault on my property, multiple casualties, and I have information connecting tonight's attack to an unsolved murder from 3 years ago. I'm going to need detectives here immediately, and I want it on record that we're cooperating fully." He paused, listening to the response on the other end, then added one final detail, his eyes drifting once more toward the small, battered dog who had started everything. "And you're going to want to bring someone from the federal task force," Jack said, "because what we found tonight isn't just about my club. It's about a network that goes a lot deeper than any of us realized. And we've got the evidence to prove it." Outside sirens began rising faintly in the distance, growing steadily louder as they approached, and inside the clubhouse amid the wreckage and the wounded and the terrible necessary violence of the night, Scrap finally closed his eyes, his mission at last complete, leaving the rest of the fight to the family he had crossed the impossible distance to save. The first police cruiser arrived within 11 minutes, followed closely by 3 more red and blue lights, washing across the compound's exterior walls in silent, rhythmic pulses. Jack stood at the entrance with his hands visible, exactly as he'd instructed every member inside to do, and when Detective Ellen Ramirez stepped out of the lead vehicle, her expression carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had seen plenty in her career, but wasn't prepared for what she was about to walk into. "Mr. Callahan," she said, approaching cautiously, one hand resting near her holster out of habit rather than active suspicion. "Dispatch said you called this in yourself." "I did," Jack said. "Everything you're about to see I want on record. We're not hiding anything tonight." Ramirez studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the door. "Show me." Inside, the scene that greeted her stopped her cold. Bodies covered with sheets pulled from the clubhouse's own supply closets, wounded survivors zip-tied, and guarded evidence markers already being placed by club members who clearly understood, even in the chaos, the importance of preserving a clean crime scene. "Jesus," Ramirez muttered, her radio crackling as she called for additional units for the coroner for federal backup the moment she spotted the scale of what she was dealing with. Jack walked her through it methodically. The dog's arrival, the collar, the micro, SD card, the confession recorded on tape, Danny's admission, the financial records connecting him to the Sacramento ambush 18 months earlier, and finally the trap they'd sprung tonight against an armed cartel strike team sent specifically to silence a dying animal who had run 100 miles carrying evidence of a murder. "You're telling me a dog is the key witness in a homicide investigation?" Ramirez said, her pen pausing over her notepad. "I'm telling you, a dog is the reason we know Arthur Davis was murdered at all," Jack said quietly. "Without him, this stays buried forever. Without him, whoever's running this operation keeps operating, keeps killing, keeps getting away with it." Ramirez's eyes drifted toward the back corner of the room where Doc Riley still worked over Scrap, stabilizing the reopened wounds, his face tight with concentration. "That's him. That's him," Jack confirmed. "He's going to need veterinary care beyond what your friend there can provide," Ramirez said. "If he's really carrying evidence, if he's really a witness in this, we might need him processed properly, photographed, documented. He gets real medical care first, Grizzly said, appearing suddenly at Jack's shoulder, his voice carrying no room for negotiation. Whatever documentation you need, it happens after he's stable, not before. Ramirez studied the massive man for a moment, taking in the barely restrained protectiveness radiating off him, and something in her expression softened slightly. Understood. I'll get an emergency vet unit out here within the hour. As the investigation expanded through the night, more vehicles arrived, federal agents in dark jackets, evidence technicians in white coveralls, a mobile command unit that parked just outside the compound's damaged gate. Danny sat in the back of an unmarked car, a blanket draped over his shoulders despite the mild temperature, his face hollow and distant as agents took his statement in careful, measured tones. Marcus watched from the distance, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. You think he gets a deal? He asked Jack quietly. Depends how much he actually gives them, Jack said. He held names, connections, financial trails. If he cooperates fully, maybe the federal prosecutors go easier than they would otherwise. That's not really up to us anymore. Feels strange, Marcus admitted, watching him get carried off in a police car instead of dealing with it ourselves. That's exactly why we're doing it this way, Jack said. Arthur didn't die so we could become the same kind of men who killed him. We do this the right way, or none of it means anything. By early morning, as the sky began lightening from black to deep gray, Detective Ramirez approached Jack again, a thick folder in hand. The names your captured men gave us cross-referenced with the financial records you provided. We're looking at something significantly larger than a single cartel cell operating independently. How large? Jack asked. Multi-county, Ramirez said grimly, possibly reaching into legitimate business fronts, shell companies, even some connections to local law enforcement that are going to require very careful handling. This isn't just going to be a homicide case anymore. This is going federal, and it's going to take months, maybe years, to fully unravel. Good, Jack said simply. Ramirez looked at him with something like surprise. Most people hearing that kind of timeline, that kind of scope, they'd be worried about how deep it drags them personally. Most people didn't watch a dying dog run 100 miles to make sure the truth got out, Jack said. We're not worried about how deep it goes. We just want it to go all the way to the bottom. As dawn broke fully over the compound, an emergency veterinary transport finally arrived, and Doc Riley, exhausted but satisfied, briefed the incoming vet on everything he'd done throughout the night, the surgery, the medications, the reopened wounds from the firefight, the remarkable, almost inexplicable resilience the animal had shown through all of it. He shouldn't be alive, the vet said, examining Scrap with careful professional hands. Not with injuries like these, not after whatever he went through before he even got here. He had a reason to stay alive, Grizzly said quietly, standing close enough that his shadow fell protectively across the makeshift medical station. That matters more than people think. The vet glanced up at him, something understanding passing across her expression. We'll want to transport him to the animal hospital for proper imaging, make sure there's no internal damage we're missing. But based on what I'm seeing, I think he's going to pull through. Grizzly's shoulders dropped, tension he'd been carrying for nearly 24 hours, finally releasing in one long exhale. Thank you, he said, and the words carried a weight that went far beyond simple gratitude. I want to ride with him, Grizzly said. To the hospital. That's not really standard procedure, the vet started. I don't care about standard procedure, Grizzly said, his voice quiet but absolutely immovable. That dog saved my life twice in the last day. I'm not letting him go anywhere alone. The vet studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, you can ride in the transport vehicle. As they carefully loaded Scrap onto a stretcher, moving him with the gentle precision reserved for the most fragile patients, his eyes opened briefly, finding Grizzly's face among the crowd of unfamiliar people surrounding him. His tail moved once weakly against the stretcher fabric. I'm right here, Grizzly said softly, walking alongside as they carried him toward the waiting vehicle. Every step of the way. I promise you that. The following days brought a whirlwind of activity that none of the club members had fully anticipated. Federal investigators descended on the compound, interviewing every member, cross-referencing, testimony, building a case file that grew thicker by the day as Danny's cooperation, driven equally by guilt and by the desperate hope of leniency, unlocked door after door into the cartel's broader operation. Jack sat across from lead federal prosecutor David Chen in a sterile conference room 3 days after the raid, reviewing evidence that painted a picture far more disturbing than anyone had initially imagined. The organization Danny Cochran was working with isn't just running drugs through this region, Chen explained, spreading photographs and financial documents across the table. They've been laundering money through a series of shell construction companies, bribing local zoning officials, even influencing land development decisions that pushed out longtime residents in 3 different counties. That's how they found Arthur, Jack said slowly, pieces clicking together in his mind. He wasn't just caught in some territory dispute. He must have stumbled onto something. Chen nodded, sliding another document across the table. We found records showing Arthur Davis made several calls to a county land registry office in the weeks before his death. He was asking questions about a development project, questions that would have exposed exactly the kind of corruption we're now uncovering. He was investigating them. Jack said, something like pride mixing with fresh grief in his voice. Even before he knew what he'd found, he was pulling at the thread. And it got him killed, Chen said quietly. But because of what he managed to preserve, because of what that dog carried across 100 miles of hostile terrain, we now have enough evidence to potentially indict 14 individuals, including 2 county officials and a construction company executive who's been operating publicly as one of the most respected businessmen in the region. Jack sat back, absorbing this magnitude of what had unfolded from a single dying dog collapsing through a steel door. 14 people, he repeated, and growing, Chen said. This is one of the largest corruption cases this office has handled in over a decade, and it started with a note hidden in a dog collar. Meanwhile, at the animal hospital, Scrap's recovery progressed steadily under constant supervision. Grizzly had barely left his side, sleeping in an uncomfortable waiting room chair, eating meals brought to him by other club members who understood, without needing explanation, exactly why he refused to leave. You know, the veterinarian said one afternoon, checking Scrap's vitals, while Grizzly watched from his usual position nearby. In 15 years of practice, I've never seen an owner as devoted as you, and you're not even technically his owner. He's not mine, Grizzly said quietly. He belongs to a man who isn't here anymore. But somebody's got to look out for him now, and I figure that job falls to me. Well, whatever you're doing, it's working, the vet said, smiling slightly. His recovery is ahead of schedule. Another week, maybe 10 days, and he should be able to go home. Home, Grizzly repeated, and something complicated passed across his face. Where exactly is home for a dog whose owner died in a desert 3 years ago? The vet paused, studying him carefully. I think you already know the answer to that question. Grizzly didn't respond immediately, but later that evening, sitting beside Scrap's recovery kennel, watching the dog's chest rise and fall, in steady, healthy rhythms, he found himself speaking softly into the quiet room. I talked to Jack, he said, about what happens after you're better, about where you go from here. Scrap's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, though his eyes remained closed, resting. We think maybe you should come stay with me, if that's all right with you. I know I'm not Arthur. I know nobody could ever replace him. But I promise you this, I'll take care of you the way he would have wanted, the way you deserve. The dog's eyes opened slowly, finding Grizzly's face in the dim light of the recovery room. And though animals couldn't truly understand human speech, something in the steady, unwavering way, Scrap looked back at him, felt like an answer all its own. Back at the compound, the investigation continued expanding, drawing increasing media attention as word spread about the scope of corruption being uncovered. Reporters began appearing outside the clubhouse gates, drawn by a story that had all the elements of compelling news: a motorcycle club, a dying dog, a murdered man, a massive corruption scandal touching local government. Jack found himself increasingly frustrated by the attention, preferring to let the investigation unfold quietly through proper channels, rather than through sensationalized headlines. But Marcus, watching the coverage build, saw an opportunity the club couldn't afford to waste. This story's going to get told with or without our input, Marcus said during one of their evening strategy sessions. Better we control the narrative than let some reporter who's never met any of us decide what people think about what happened here. What are you suggesting? Jack asked. One statement, Marcus said. Clear, factual, focused on Arthur's memory rather than sensationalizing the violence. We honor what he sacrificed, we acknowledge Scrap's role, and we let people understand this was about justice, not about glorifying what happened that night. Jack considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Draft something. I want to see it before it goes anywhere. 3 days later, standing outside the clubhouse gates, Jack delivered a brief statement to the assembled press. His words measured and deliberate, carrying none of the bravado outsiders often expected from a man in his position. 3 years ago, we lost a brother. Jack said, his voice steady, despite the emotion clearly visible beneath the surface. Arthur Davis was murdered because he uncovered corruption that powerful people wanted buried forever. For 3 years, we believed we'd never know what happened to him, never have the chance to seek justice on his behalf. He paused, glancing toward Grizzly, who stood nearby holding a leash attached to a healing bandaged dog, watching the gathered crowd with cautious, alert eyes. That changed because of Arthur's dog Scrap, who survived injuries that should have killed him, who crossed distances that should have been impossible, all to bring us the truth his owner died trying to expose. We're not going to stand here and pretend the events of that night weren't violent, weren't difficult. But we will stand here and tell you that justice, real justice, is finally being served, not through vengeance, but through cooperation with law enforcement, through evidence, through the truth finally coming to light. He looked directly into the cameras, his expression hardening slightly. To anyone still out there who played a role in Arthur's death, in the corruption that's now being exposed, know this. The investigation isn't finished. It's only beginning. And we will not rest until everyone responsible faces justice. The statement dominated news coverage for days afterward, and public sentiment, much to everyone's surprise, shifted dramatically in the club's favor. Donations began arriving at the compound, not requested, simply offered by strangers, moved by the story of loyalty and sacrifice that had unfolded. Local veterinary clinics offered free ongoing care for Scrap. A local business owner whose family had been displaced years earlier by the very corruption now being exposed arrived personally to thank the club for what they'd uncovered. "You gave us something we never thought we'd get," the man said, standing in the clubhouse doorway, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave us the truth. My father lost his farm to that development scheme. Died still fighting the paperwork, still convinced somebody had cheated him, and nobody believed him until now." Jack shook the man's hand solemnly. Arthur believed him too. That's what got him killed. We're just finishing what he started. As the investigation deepened, Detective Ramirez returned to the compound with updates that continued to reveal the staggering scope of what they'd uncovered. "We've traced the corruption back nearly 8 years, she told Jack during one visit. Multiple county officials, at least 3 legitimate businesses used as fronts, and connections extending into 2 additional states. This is easily the largest case my department has ever touched, and it's still growing." "What about the men we captured that night?" Jack asked. "Cooperating mostly," Ramirez said, "facing enough charges that testifying against the higher levels of the organization is their only real chance at reduced sentences. We're building a case that's going to put a lot of powerful people away for a very long time. And Danny," Ramirez's expression grew more complicated. "He's cooperating fully. Given everything he's provided, prosecutors are considering a plea deal, reduced federal charges, in exchange for testimony against the organization's leadership. He's looking at significant prison time regardless, but not the life sentence he might have faced otherwise." Jack absorbed this information silently, thinking of the young man who had sat trembling in the clubhouse just days earlier, confessing to a betrayal that had cost Arthur his life. Does he deserve leniency? "That's not really for me to decide," Ramirez said carefully. "But I will say this, without his cooperation, without the details he's provided about internal cartel operations, we wouldn't have nearly the case we're building now. Sometimes justice isn't clean. Sometimes it requires using flawed, complicated people to reach the people who are truly responsible." 2 weeks after the raid, Scrap was finally cleared for release from the veterinary hospital. Grizzly arrived early that morning, having barely slept the night before from anticipation, carrying a new collar he'd had specially made, simple, sturdy leather, far more modern than the weathered original that had carried Knuckles' final message, but crafted with the same careful attention to detail. "Ready to go home?" Grizzly asked, kneeling down as the veterinary technician led Scrap out on a temporary leash. The dog's tail wagged, not the weak, exhausted movement from weeks earlier, but something stronger, more vibrant, a genuine expression of joy that made Grizzly's chest tighten with emotion he hadn't expected. "He's made a remarkable recovery," the vet said, smiling as she watched the reunion. "Physically, he's healed better than we could have hoped. Emotionally, well, dogs process trauma differently than we do, but he seems to have bonded strongly with you specifically." "Feelings mutual," Grizzly said carefully, fastening the new collar around Scrap's neck, his large hands moving with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who only knew him by reputation. As they drove back toward the compound, Scrap sitting alert and curious in the passenger seat beside him, Grizzly found himself talking quietly, almost as if the dog could fully understand every word. "Things are different now," he said. "The club's changing. This whole thing with Arthur, with what happened, it's made everybody think differently about what we're supposed to be doing out here. Jack's talking about starting something new. A foundation, maybe. Something that helps families like the ones that got hurt by whoever killed Arthur." Scrap's head turned toward him, ears perked with what almost seemed like understanding. "Arthur would have liked that," Grizzly continued. "He always talked about the club being more than just business, more than just riding together. He believed we were supposed to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Guess that's exactly what you did too, isn't it? Protected the people who couldn't protect themselves anymore." When they arrived back at the compound, the entire club had gathered outside to welcome Scrap, home a small, spontaneous celebration that felt entirely appropriate given everything the dog had endured to bring them to this moment. Marcus had even convinced the local butcher to donate a generous supply of meat scraps, and the resulting feast, shared between 31 hardened bikers and one thoroughly spoiled dog, carried a warmth that had been noticeably absent from the clubhouse in the weeks following Arthur's disappearance 3 years earlier. "To Arthur," Jack said, raising a glass as the gathering quieted, "and to Scrap, who never stopped believing his message needed to reach us no matter what it cost him. To Arthur." The room echoed, glasses raised, voices thick with emotion that had been building for weeks, finally finding release in this moment of hard-won celebration. Scrap, seated beside Grizzly's boots, looked up at the assembled crowd, tail wagging steadily, seemingly aware in whatever way a dog could be aware that he had finally truly arrived somewhere safe. But even as the celebration continued, Jack found himself pulled aside by Marcus, whose expression had shifted into something more serious. "What is it?" Jack asked quietly, stepping away from the gathering. "Ramirez called," Marcus said. "There's been a development. One of the county officials named in the investigation, the one who approved the original development project that displaced Arthur's neighbors, he's disappeared. Fled the country 2 days ago, apparently. Federal agents think he had advance warning, someone tipping him off before they could execute the arrest." Jack's jaw tightened. "Somebody inside the investigation?" "They're not sure yet," Marcus said, "but it means whoever's still out there, whoever's still protecting this network, they're not done fighting. Not by a long shot." Jack glanced back toward the celebration, toward Scrap's happy healing form, nestled against Grizzly's leg, toward the club members finally allowing themselves a moment of genuine joy after weeks of grief and violence and uncertainty. "Then we're not done either," Jack said quietly. "Arthur didn't die so we could stop halfway through the truth. We finish this, all of it, no matter how deep it goes, no matter who tries to disappear before facing what they've done." Behind him, the celebration continued, warm and hopeful, but Jack's mind had already shifted toward the next fight, toward the reality that justice, real and complete, rarely arrived all at once, and that the truth Scrap had carried across 100 miles of hell was only the beginning of a much longer road toward making things right. The name of the missing county official hit every wire service within hours. Preston Holloway, director of regional development, gone without a trace. His private jet's flight plan filed for a country with no extradition treaty. Detective Ramirez called Jack directly the following morning, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "He didn't run alone," she said. "We pulled his phone records before he went dark. 43 calls to a number we can't trace yet, all in the 72 hours before your raid. Somebody warned him this was coming." "Somebody inside your investigation," Jack said. "Or somebody who had access to information about it," Ramirez said carefully. "I'm not accusing my own people, not yet. But there's a leak somewhere, and it's the same reason we're now looking at a construction executive named Richard Voss, who suddenly liquidated 2 properties and moved $600,000 offshore the same week Holloway disappeared." Jack felt something cold settle into his chest. "You're telling me the people at the top of this thing are slipping through your fingers while the men who actually pulled triggers sit in county lockup?" "I'm telling you we're not finished," Ramirez said, "and I need something from you. The financial records you pulled on Danny, the ones that first cracked this case open, do you still have the original documentation before it went through our evidence processing?" "Marcus has copies," Jack said. "Why?" "Because if there's a leak inside my department, I don't trust our own evidence chain right now," Ramirez admitted. I need something clean, something that hasn't passed through hands I can't verify. Jack called Marcus into the office within minutes, and by that afternoon they'd assembled every scrap of original documentation. The micro SD card, the bloodstained note, the financial records, copies of everything that had never touched official channels into a single secured drive that Ramirez collected personally, refusing to let anyone else on her team even see it. "This stays between us until I understand who I can trust," she said. Grizzly, standing near the doorway with Scrap resting at his feet, watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. "You really think it goes that high, cops involved? I think 3 years ago somebody powerful enough to make a county official disappear also had enough reach to make sure Arthur Davis's murder investigation went nowhere," Ramirez said. "That kind of reach doesn't come cheap, and it doesn't come without help from inside institutions people are supposed to trust." The words settled heavily over the room. Jack looked down at Scrap, who had lifted his head at the sound of raised voices. Ears perked alert, despite weeks of healing that had brought back much of his strength. "Then we keep pulling the thread," Jake said, "all the way to the end." 3 days later, Marcus burst into the main room with his laptop already open, his expression a mixture of triumph and alarm. "I found something. Voss's shell companies. I traced the ownership structure back further than the federal investigators bothered to look, and there's a name buried under 4 layers of holding companies that's going to blow this whole thing wide open." "Who?" Jack asked. Marcus turned the laptop around. On the screen was a corporate filing dense with legal language, but one name stood out clearly among the listed board members. "Senator Whitmore," Marcus said. "Sitting state senator. He's been quietly profiting from this development scheme for 6 years, using Voss's construction company as a front to push zoning changes that displaced dozens of families across 3 counties, Arthur's neighbors included." Jack stared at the name for a long moment. "This isn't corruption anymore. This is an entire political operation. And it explains why Holloway got tipped off," Marcus said. "A sitting senator has resources none of the small players in this network could match. If he found out federal agents were closing in, he'd have every reason to help his people disappear before they could talk." Jack's phone buzzed almost immediately, as if summoned by the discovery itself. It was Ramirez, her voice tight with urgency. "We need to talk, now, in person, not over the phone." She arrived within the hour, and the moment she saw Marcus's laptop screen, her face went pale. "How did you find this?" "Marcus is better at digging through shell companies than half your forensic accountants," Jack said. Ramirez sat down heavily, rubbing her temples. "This changes everything. If Whitmore's involved, we're not talking about a regional corruption case anymore. We're talking about state-level political corruption with potential federal implications reaching into campaign finance, public office abuse, possibly obstruction of an active homicide investigation." "Can you move on him?" Jack asked. "Carefully," Ramirez said, "very carefully. A sitting senator has legal protections, resources, connections that make this exponentially more complicated than arresting cartel enforcers in a clubhouse raid. We need ironclad evidence, multiple independent verification sources, and probably a joint task force with federal prosecutors before we can even think about approaching him directly." "How long?" Grizzly asked, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Weeks, maybe months," Ramirez admitted. "But every day we wait is a day he has to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, or disappear entirely like Holloway did." Jack looked toward Scrap, who had settled onto the floor beside Grizzly's boots, watching the tense conversation with the quiet alertness that had become his constant companion since the night of the raid. "Arthur found this thread 3 years ago," Jack said quietly. "He died pulling it. We're not going to let it snap now, not when we're this close." That evening, as the club settled into an uneasy quiet, Danny Cochran's federal defense attorney requested an unusual meeting, one that included Jack held at a neutral location under careful supervision. "My client has additional information," the attorney explained, seated across from Jack in a nondescript conference room. "Information he's been reluctant to share because it implicates someone he was genuinely afraid of, someone whose reach he believes extends into your own club." Jack's expression darkened. "Say that again." The attorney glanced at Danny, who sat pale and hollow-eyed beside him. "Tell him," the attorney said quietly. Danny's hands trembled as he spoke. "The night everything happened before the raid, somebody called me. Not the cartel, somebody else. A voice I didn't recognize, but they knew things. They knew about Scrap, about the collar, about what you'd found. They told me if I didn't handle things quietly, if this thing became public, there would be consequences beyond what the cartel could deliver. Who was it? Jack demanded. I don't know, Danny said, his voice cracking. But they mentioned Whitmore's name. Just once, almost like a warning, like they wanted me to understand exactly how far up this went. Jack sat back, processing this new information with growing alarm. You're telling me the senator himself reached out to a low-level prospect to try controlling the situation? Or someone working for him, Danny said. Someone who's been watching this club a lot more closely than any of us realized. The revelation sent a fresh wave of urgency through the investigation. Jack returned to the compound, immediately calling an emergency meeting with Marcus Grizzly and Frank, laying out everything Danny had revealed. If Whitmore's people have been watching us, Frank said, watching close enough to know what we found the same night we found it, that means somebody's been feeding them information in real time. A leak inside the club, Grizzly said grimly. Or surveillance, Marcus said. Cameras wiretap something we haven't found yet. They spent the following 2 days sweeping the entire compound, uncovering nothing initially until Marcus, working through the clubhouse's network infrastructure, discovered a small, sophisticated device hidden inside an old router that had supposedly stopped working months earlier. This isn't cartel-level tech, Marcus said, holding up the device for Jack to examine. This is professional surveillance equipment, government-grade or close to it. How long has it been there? Jack asked. Marcus checked the internal logs. Based on the data timestamps, at least 4 months. Somebody's been listening to everything said in this room since well before Scrap ever showed up. The implications hit the room like a physical weight. Every conversation, every strategy session, every private discussion about Arthur's murder had potentially been monitored from the very beginning by someone connected to the exact network they were trying to expose. They knew we were getting close, Jack said slowly. That's why they sent the cartel strike team that night. Not just to silence Scrap, to silence all of us before we could dig any further. Ramirez, informed immediately of the discovery, arrived within the hour with a forensic technician who carefully extracted the device for analysis. If this traces back to Whitmore's people, she said, that's evidence of illegal surveillance obstruction, potentially conspiracy to commit violence against private citizens. This could be exactly the kind of ironclad evidence we needed. 3 tense weeks followed, filled with careful, methodical investigation, as federal prosecutors built a case complex enough to withstand the legal resources a sitting senator could muster in his defense. Jack found himself in near constant communication with Ramirez and Chen, providing testimony, documentation, and support as the case expanded into something far larger than anyone had initially anticipated. Throughout it all, Scrap continued his recovery, growing stronger each day, his limp fading into a barely noticeable hitch in his gait, his coat filling out into something healthy and vibrant that bore little resemblance to the broken, bloodied animal who had collapsed through the clubhouse door weeks earlier. Grizzly had transformed his own small apartment above the garage into something resembling a proper home for the dog, purchasing a comfortable bed toys that mostly went ignored in favor of simply following Grizzly from room to room, and a routine that gave the animal something he'd clearly been missing since Arthur's death. Stability, predictability, someone whose presence meant safety. You've gotten soft, Frank teased one afternoon, watching Grizzly carefully portion out the dog's specially prescribed recovery diet with the precision of a man measuring out ammunition. Maybe, Grizzly said, not looking up, or maybe I finally understand what Arthur was trying to protect all those years. Not just the club, not just business. This. He gestured towards Scrap, now curled contentedly in his bed, watching the exchange with drowsy interest. Something worth coming home to. The breakthrough in the Whitmore investigation came unexpectedly, nearly a month after the raid, when a former campaign staffer, motivated by conscience or fear, or some combination of both, approached federal investigators with detailed records of illegal campaign contributions funneled through Voss's shell companies directly into Whitmore's re-election fund. This is it, Chen told Jack during an update call, his voice carrying genuine excitement for the first time in weeks. Combined with the surveillance device, Danny's testimony, and the financial trail Marcus uncovered, we finally have enough to move. Grand jury convenes next week. What happens to Whitmore? Jack asked. Federal indictment, Chen said. Multiple counts, including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accessory charges related to Arthur Davis's murder. He's going to be arrested before this becomes public, before he has any chance to run like Holloway did. The arrest, when it finally happened, dominated national news coverage for days. Senator Whitmore led out of his own campaign headquarters in handcuffs, his carefully cultivated public image shattering in real time, before television cameras that had until that morning treated him as a rising political star. Jack watched the coverage from the clubhouse surrounded by the men who had risked everything to bring this moment into existence. Scrap resting peacefully at Grizzly's feet, seemingly indifferent to the historic nature of what was unfolding on the screen above him. "It's over," Marcus said quietly, watching Whitmore's stone-faced expression as he was escorted into a federal vehicle. "Not quite," Jack said. "This is just the arrest. The trial's going to take months, maybe years with the kind of legal team he can afford." "But he's exposed," Frank said. "Whatever happens in court, the truth's already out there. He can't hide from that anymore." Ramirez arrived at the compound that same evening looking more relaxed than Jack had seen her since the night of the raid. "I wanted to tell you in person," she said. "The full scope of what you helped uncover. We're talking about the largest corruption case this state has seen in decades. 14 indictments and counting connections stretching into 2 additional states, and it all traces back to a single note hidden in a dog collar. Arthur would want to know it mattered," Jack said quietly, "that he didn't die for nothing." "He didn't," Ramirez said firmly, "because of what he uncovered, because of what that dog carried through hell to bring you families who lost their homes to corrupt development schemes are finally going to see justice. People who thought their voices didn't matter are finally being heard." She paused, glancing toward Scrap, who had lifted his head at the sound of her voice. "I've seen a lot of things in this job. Things that make you lose faith in people and systems, in whether justice really means anything at all. This case, what happened here, it's given me something I didn't expect to feel again. Hope, maybe." As the legal proceedings ground forward through the following months, the club found itself transformed by everything they had experienced. Jack, working alongside Marcus and several other members, established the Arthur Davis Foundation, dedicated to supporting families displaced by corrupt development practices, providing legal resources, financial assistance, and advocacy for people who had been ignored or dismissed by systems that were supposed to protect them. The Foundation's first major project centered on the same neighborhood Arthur had originally been investigating dozens of families who had lost their homes years earlier, to the fraudulent zoning changes now exposed as part of Whitmore's broader scheme. Working with newly elected local officials committed to reform, the foundation helped secure compensation, legal restitution, and in several cases, actual return of properties that had been seized under fraudulent pretenses. "This is what he would have wanted," Jack said during the foundation's official launch, standing before a small crowd of grateful families outside a community center the foundation had helped fund. "Not vengeance, not violence for its own sake, just people finally getting what they were owed, all along the truth and the chance to rebuild what was taken from them." Danny Cochran's case concluded quietly months later with a plea agreement that acknowledged his cooperation while still holding him accountable for his role in Arthur's death. 15 years with possibility of reduced time for continued cooperation in ongoing related prosecutions. Jack visited him once before his transfer to federal prison, standing on opposite sides of a thick glass partition. "I don't expect forgiveness," Danny said quietly through the small speaker embedded in the glass. "I'm not here to offer it," Jack said honestly. "I'm here because Arthur believed in second chances, believed people could find their way back from mistakes if they were willing to face them honestly. You did that eventually. It doesn't undo what happened, but it matters." Danny's eyes filled with tears he made no effort to hide. "Tell Grizzly, tell him I'm sorry. I know it doesn't mean anything coming from me, but I am." "He knows," Jack said simply and left without further words, understanding that some wounds took longer than a single conversation to even begin healing. As autumn settled over the compound, bringing cooler air and shorter days, Scrap had fully recovered his limp. Completely gone, his energy returned to something approaching the vibrant animal he must have been before tragedy struck his original owner. He'd become something of an unofficial mascot for the club, greeting visitors at the gate, accompanying Grizzly on shorter motorcycle rides in a specially designed carrier, embodying a symbol of loyalty and resilience that resonated deeply with everyone who heard his story. The Arthur Davis Foundation continued expanding its reach, eventually helping over 200 families across the 3 affected counties, its work fueled by donations that poured in from across the country. As Scrap's story spread through news coverage, social media, and eventually a series of interviews Jack reluctantly agreed to, always insisting the focus remain on Arthur's memory, and the families helped rather than the club itself. One evening, nearly 6 months after the night, everything changed. Jack found Grizzly sitting alone near the compound's perimeter fence, Scrap curled beside him, both watching the sunset in comfortable silence. "You ever think about how close we came to losing all of this?" Jack asked, settling onto the ground beside them. "If Scrap hadn't made it through that door, if Doc hadn't managed to stabilize him in time, if Danny had gotten that warning message out before we could stop him." "Every day," Grizzly admitted. "But he did make it, and somehow out of everything that could have gone wrong that night, it all came together exactly the way it needed to." Scrap's tail thumped softly against the ground, as if agreeing with the assessment. "Whitmore's trial starts next month," Jack said. "Chen thinks the evidence is strong enough that a plea deal is likely before it even goes to a full jury." "Feels strange," Grizzly said. "Knowing a man that powerful, that protected, is finally going to answer for what he did. For 3 years, we thought Arthur just vanished. Thought maybe he'd gotten tired of the life, started over somewhere new. Never imagined he was murdered because he stumbled onto something this massive. He was always looking out for people who couldn't look out for themselves," Jack said quietly, "even when it cost him everything." They sat together as the sun disappeared below the horizon, the compound behind them settling into the quiet rhythms of evening, the weight of everything they'd endured finally beginning to feel less like an open wound and more like a scar, painful still, but healed evidence of survival rather than ongoing suffering. "I've been thinking," Grizzly said after a long silence, "about Scrap's collar. The original one with Arthur's name burned into it. I want to have it properly preserved, maybe displayed somewhere in the clubhouse. Not as a trophy, as a reminder." "Of what happened?" Jack asked. "Of what loyalty actually means," Grizzly said. "Arthur died protecting people he'd never even met, exposing corruption that would have kept hurting families for years if he hadn't pulled that thread. And this dog," he rested his hand gently on Scrap's head, who leaned into the touch with obvious contentment. "This dog crossed 100 miles of hell because he refused to let that sacrifice be forgotten. That's worth remembering. Every single day." Jack nodded slowly, watching the last light fade from the sky. "We'll build a memorial wall. Arthur's name, the names of every family the foundations helped because of what he uncovered. And we'll put that collar right at the center of it, exactly where it belongs." The following spring, the memorial was unveiled during a ceremony that drew far more attendance than anyone had anticipated. Club members, past and present families, helped by the Foundation federal investigators who had worked the case, even Detective Ramirez, who had become an unlikely but genuine friend to the club throughout the long months of investigation and prosecution. The wall itself was simple but powerful. Arthur Davis's name carved into reclaimed wood, salvaged from one of the properties the Foundation had helped restore to its rightful owners, surrounded by smaller plaques bearing the names of every family whose lives had been changed by the truth he'd sacrificed everything to protect. At the center, mounted in a protective glass case, sat the original leather collar, weathered and worn, the name burned into its surface still clearly visible, despite everything it had endured. Jack stood before the assembled crowd, Scrap sitting calmly beside him, now fully grown into the confident, healthy animal he'd always been meant to be before tragedy interrupted his life. 3 years ago, we lost a brother," Jack said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet gathering. "We didn't know why, we didn't know how, we just knew he was gone, and that absence left a wound none of us really knew how to heal." He paused, looking down at the collar in its glass case, then back up at the crowd. "What we learned since then is that Arthur Davis never stopped fighting for what was right, even when it cost him his life. He uncovered corruption that had been hurting families for years. Corruption powerful enough to reach into our own state government, powerful enough to think it could bury the truth forever." His eyes moved to Grizzly, standing nearby with his hand resting protectively on Scrap's back. But Arthur knew something his enemies never understood. Loyalty doesn't die just because the person carrying it does. He trusted that if anything happened to him, his dog would find a way to bring the truth home. And against every possible odd, against injuries that should have killed him twice over, against 100 miles of hostile terrain, Scrap did exactly that. The crowd remained silent, absorbing every word, many faces marked with tears they made no effort to hide. Because of that loyalty, because of one dog's refusal to give up, we exposed a corruption network that had been destroying families for nearly a decade. We help families like the Hendersons, the Millers, the Castellanos reclaim homes that were stolen from them through fraud and deceit. We brought a sitting senator to justice along with 14 others who thought their power made them untouchable. Jack's voice grew stronger, carrying conviction that resonated through every person present. Arthur Davis died believing that even one person, even one act of courage could change everything. He was right, and the proof of that isn't just carved into this wall behind me. It's living, breathing, standing right here beside us today. He gestured toward Scrap, who looked up at the sound of his name being invoked, tail wagging steadily against the ground. This is not simply the story of a motorcycle club protecting one of its own. This is proof that loyalty, sacrifice, and the refusal to let truth stay buried can overcome even the most powerful corruption imaginable. Arthur's legacy doesn't end with his death. It lives on in every family this foundation helps, in every piece of justice served, and in the dog who loved him enough to cross impossible distances just to make sure his voice was finally heard. The crowd erupted into applause, warm and genuine, and as it washed over the gathering, Grizzly knelt down beside Scrap, resting his forehead briefly against the dog's, a private moment of gratitude shared between two survivors who had found something unexpected in each other. Purpose, healing, and an unbreakable bond forged through tragedy and triumph in equal measure. Arthur Davis never lived to see the truth he died protecting finally reach the light. But his legacy did not end in that desert 3 years ago. It rode on, carried forward by a dog who refused to quit, by brothers who refused to let his sacrifice be forgotten, and by a justice system finally forced to confront corruption it had ignored for far too long. What began as a broken, bleeding animal collapsing through a steel door became the spark that dismantled a network of lies protecting the powerful at the expense of the innocent. And in the end, that is the truest measure of loyalty, not the length of the distance traveled, but the unwavering refusal to let the people we love be forgotten. Arthur Davis's story did not end in tragedy. It ended in justice, in healing, and in a promise fulfilled completely.